A common question that I get regarding military reenactment is, how do you determine who gets hit? Why not use airsoft guns or paintballs to make it more fair? Maybe even a Miles laser system like some real-life militaries use for their training exercises. And I think that this is a really interesting question. Not only is it a practical concern for a super esoteric and weird hobby that most people are unfamiliar with, but it also speaks to the wider purpose of reenactment and to what makes it potentially valuable beyond just being a hobby, both for the participant and for potential spectators. So the short answer to that first question is that for the most part, there really isn't a system. Unless you count the honor system, there isn't a formal way in which participants can determine who has been hit and who hasn't. When you decide to take your hit, it's more based on whether you feel it's appropriate to happen at that time. Did you round a corner right into a machine gun? Well, you should probably take a hit. Did your company just get blasted point blank by a cannon? Yeah, probably time to take a hit. And then there's also the more personal reasons why you may want to. Is your musket just not cooperating that day? Or maybe you're just really tired and you're overheated. You need to become a convenient casualty in a shaded part of the field. Another common one is that if your side is predetermined to lose that day for a public event, then you can expect that side to be taking far more casualties as they go, especially towards the end of the battle, just to help demonstrate that. Now, there are exceptions to that general rule. Some events will be considered tactical events, and they'll have judges with the different groups who might even be communicating with walkie-talkies, and they can tell individuals when they need to take a hit and when not. And that can be helpful if there's an event with like snipers or ambushes, for example. And then obviously, of course, when it comes to things like medieval reenactment, well, there really isn't a need for a judge there to tell you if you've been bunked on the head with an axe. There's even some events that will actually fire projectiles, like the World War I event in Newville, Pennsylvania, for example, but those are definitely the exception and not the rule. In that case, it's basically just little light canisters that go pop in order to simulate grenades or gas or mortar rounds and the like. But for the most part, nothing's ever going to be coming out of the rifles themselves. So why not use a projectile system, something like airsoft or paintballs? Wouldn't it be so much more fair than just, for the most part, relying on people to play nice? I mean, if you're a reenactor, then there is no doubt you've been incredibly frustrated before by people just refusing to take their hits. And whether you realize it or not, you've most assuredly been that guy too. Well, one of the big things is the issue of safety. For obvious reasons, if you're shooting a projectile at someone, they need to wear certain safety equipment, primarily eye protection. And in a lot of people's views, well, that can kind of ruin the appearance. I mean, we spend so much money on every little bit of the uniform being period correct, right down to the kinds of fabric being used and it all being hand sewn in some cases. But then, on top of all of that effort, you're just going to add these painfully obvious goggles or safety glasses? I mean, it kind of takes you out of the moment, Now, that being said, sometimes you do want to be taken out of the moment. Reenactments can be stressful, and sometimes you just want to relax with some fun of a more modern sort, which perfectly brings us to the sponsor of this video, Royal Match. Now, what is Royal Match, you may ask? Well, it's a delightful little mobile game where you're tasked with the immensely important role of aiding His Majesty King Robert to restore his castle to its former glory in the form of a Match 3 puzzle game. Not only is it a perfect little escape from the chaos of recreated battle, but you'll even be able to play anywhere on the field because the game doesn't require an internet connection. It's also free to play and it doesn't even have any ads. That means you'll be able to get in a few matches wherever you are, whether it's stuck inside an infantry square, lost in the enemy's trench line, or even flying high above the skies. You won't have to worry about running out of those levels either, because there's over 7,000 levels in the game. In fact, the war will probably end before you even get close to finishing them all. Or the reenactment. I'm starting to lose the narrative here. But hey, I mean, can you blame me? The game has endless variety and unique events. It's so easy to get lost in it. But I suppose I should get back to the video now with a special thanks to Royal Match for sponsoring it. Be sure to download the game using the description down below and enjoy your ad-free experience. Remember that when you support the sponsors who are supporting my channel, you're also helping me out to an incredible degree. So thank you, not only for your time, but for checking out the game. Now, let's get back to this idea of using projectiles in reenactments. Another potentially much more significant problem is that any kind of projectile could potentially cause damage to those expensive uniforms. You know, it's one thing for me to lose an eye or something, it's quite another for that, $500 coat to be damaged. If I go out and custom commission a regimental coat for hundreds of dollars, and sometimes these full outfits can run into the thousands, you think that I want someone shooting at it? A BB that could potentially put a hole in the fabric, or even worse, a paintball? No, absolutely not. Okay, now looking naturally a little grimy over time, though that's fine. If I'm at a World War I event, I want the uniform to be a little bit muddy by the end of it. But that's going to be a whole lot easier to wash out and a lot more accurate than paint is ever going to be. And it also doesn't require additional sewing to fix the issue. And as well, that's all to say nothing of how at least certain kinds of reenactment events, you can expect people to be actually carrying real-life historical artifacts as a part of their impression. Especially in like World War reenactment, a lot of the clothing and weapons and such can actually be from the time period. My SMLE is from 1917, and my bayonet is an original too. So are the shoulder titles and the cap badges that I wear, a lot of different parts of these outfits. And I don't want anyone shooting them with anything, paint, BB, whatever. So, okay then, what about lasers? There's no risk of damage to the kit that way, right? Well, yeah, sure, but again, then there's the issue of taking these costumes, which ought to look as close to entirely historical as we can get, and you have to cover them with all this modern technology. It would ruin the appearance, and it would take away from one of reenactment's most key components, being the recreation of material culture, which basically just means all of the stuff that was used historically, and then how that stuff impacted the how and why people did things as they did. And for all of these different systems, regardless of how precisely they work, well, they're going to involve using a device other than a real firearm. Now, a lot of people are surprised to hear this, but yes, reenactors are, for the most part, using real guns. The only exception being things like gas-fired machine guns, when fully automatic weapons aren't allowed by law. Things like that, little things. But all of my firearms, the musket, the Mosin, the SMLE, all of them are fully capable of firing live rounds, and I have done so with all of them. The only difference is that at a reenactment, we're firing blank rounds. The same stuff as a real round, it has the same casing, the same powder, it just doesn't have an actual bullet that gets shot out of the barrel. And this means that as we're marching around with muskets or rifles on our shoulder, well then we know what the actual weight of that gun is like, what it feels like. We can feel the grains of the wood. We know how hot the barrel gets after it's fired. We experience, with more or less accuracy, depending on all sorts of, super niche details that we don't need to get into now, but the entire idea is that we're approaching, at least experiencing, the same difficulties that would have been dealt with by historical figures. Guns getting jammed, bolts getting stuck, flints getting dull, powder becoming wet, all of those different things, right? And likewise, when everyone is using these real firearms rather than airsoft guns or something, well then it gets us much closer to the sights and sounds of battle as well. The distant popping and crackling of the guns, the muzzle flashes and the clouds of smoke. If we're using airsoft or lasers or paintball, well then all of that would be gone unless it's being artificially created, and that wouldn't be anywhere near so convincing.
Go, 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 go! Come on, come on, shit!
Obviously, a blank round is going to sound and feel different from a live one, but it's a lot better than a BB could ever become. And another big factor here is that, from the perspective of historical recreation, even if we were able to replicate all of these factors, and even if we didn't need any kind of protection and all the rest, well then using BBs and lasers or anything else wouldn't offer anything close to the realistic performance of these historical weapons systems. The accuracy and range of the devices would be way off. The aerodynamics of a musket ball or a round of .303 are always going to be very different from a plastic BB flying through the air. And that in turn would result in either far too many or indeed far too few casualties to even have an event to start with. Although that isn't to say that the honor system is very good at accurately replicating casualty counts either, but that's something I'll cover a bit later on, and really it could be a whole other video rant in and of itself. But for now, like I said, all of this I think speaks to what the actual purpose of reenactment is, or at least to what the purpose of it should be. And that isn't to be a competition or a sport or anything where we need to keep track of what side is winning. Rather, reenactment ought to be considered a kind of improv performance. It's a play, a show, with education at its heart and entertainment as one of its many consequences. The point isn't to go out and prove that you're the most tactical person on the field or whatever. As it is, issues with the scale of these reenactments and the complete inability to replicate accurately very important things like individual privation, the motivations of real-life historical soldiers, saying nothing of heavy artillery and the like. It's impossible to really capture any of those elements in these events. And that means that any kind of real tactical value, it's gonna be lost. These things are gonna be ahistorical in those regards, to say the least. Rather, because of that, because you can't really emulate the historical tactical reality, the point of these events instead is for every individual on the field to gain a little insight more into the feel, into the sights and the sounds, the smells, the material culture and the feeling of an historical environment which is otherwise unattainable to us. When I go to a World War I reenactment, I don't want to just get hit by a paintball. That's not where the value is there. The value is from running through a trench at night, flares popping off overhead, people screaming orders, and gunfire going off all around me. When I go to a Napoleonic event, I don't care which side is going to win at the end of the day. I want to be surrounded with a great field of smoke as I slowly begin to discern the glinting of French bayonets just ahead of me, the sergeant screaming to prime and load while the drums are pounding in my ears and the taste of gunpowder fills my mouth as I bite way too low down on that cartridge. Yeah, it's a common experience. But anyways, the same thing I think can apply for the spectators of these events as well, and they do have spectators. Because at its best, reenactment is all about public education and the public being able to see a good, historically authentic performance. A good improv-style play that seeks to recreate historical events can be an amazing educational tool. I mean, where else can the public witness firsthand what a cannon going off sounds like, what 10 cannons going off sounds like? It isn't about winning, it's about the experience. And, to be fair, if that's not the kind of thing that you want, if you do want more of the competition, well then there are groups that do historical airsoft. They're just different kinds of events. I mean, one of these days I'd love to get to an airsoft match. I'm sure it'd be a lot of fun and probably has all sorts of different value offers that I'm not familiar with. Neither hobby is better than the other. They're just targeting different goals. They're aiming to achieve different things. Although, I will say that there is a problem, I think, when individuals get these two very different kinds of events confused. When people look at public reenactments where education is intended to be the primary objective, and instead of treating it like volunteering, they treat it like a big game. They don't want to do what's historical, they want to do what's fun. They don't want to do what's best for the public, they want to do what's best for themselves and their own experience. Some people in this vein will just refuse adamantly to take their hits. I cannot tell you how many times I've been in a firing line blazing away volley after volley into 3 militiamen, and they just refuse to move or take any kind of hint as to what would be realistic in that situation because, well, they spent the money, they drove out to shoot some redcoats, and that's what they're gonna do. The public be damned. Another good example of exactly that would be how the majority of battle reenactments are being fought way, way too close to one another and look kind of ridiculous as a result. If you ever need to elevate your musket because it's too dangerous to shoot otherwise, well, there's a simple answer to that question. You shouldn't be shooting it anyways then. Most battle reenactments are taking place at spitting distance when they should be done barely at shouting range. But, that's a whole other topic that I'll be sure to dedicate a video to later on. But it does mean, just to cover it briefly, that, at the ranges being fought, the number of casualties are insanely low, and it really helps to reaffirm the public's view that, in the case of linear warfare, like muskets are way more inaccurate than they really are. In reality, if you have a volley at 50 yards, most of those rounds should be landing, whereas at a reenactment, you'll maybe see one guy go down, if any at all. And then, oh goodness me, on top of all that, that's to say nothing about how many different individuals at reenactments will use deaths and taking hits as an opportunity to overact, dramatically so, and sometimes even make it into a little joke. Ah, you got me, oh no. That's a rant for another day, but I'm really not a fan of using death as comedic relief. But you know what? Sorry, this video isn't meant to be me ranting about all the problems with the reenactment community. I can do that another time. For the most part, it's still a great hobby, and I do think it has amazing educational value. I just like to complain. So we're gonna save all that for another day, hopefully sometime soon. But I hope that all this can help to answer the question of how reenactment works, why we do it, and why we don't use things like airsoft or paintball rounds to keep track of who gets hit and who doesn't, quote unquote. I also hope that if you yourself are a reenactor, then this video might help to promote another way of looking at our hobby and the function that it serves, or at least the function that it can serve. Try not to think of it as a game. It's not a sport so much as it is an improv educational performance. You're not just there to have fun, you're there as a volunteer, and the public always has to come first. I think that, having that mentality to it will really help you to enjoy the events a lot more, and it's going to create a better experience for everyone. So thank you all for watching. Most especially, thank you to my ever-beneficent supporting classes on Patreon, for it is only by virtue of their generosity that I'm able to carry on with my work. And until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.